Welcome to this session. I've got a bit of a script by way of introduction, so I shall start. So welcome to this session, exploring the old chestnut, what is cinema? My name is Mark Cosgrove. I'm the cinema curator at Watershed in Bristol, and delighted to be joined by two important figures in British cinema and film culture, and who have been important in shaping and informing my practice. I'm going to introduce John and Heather in a second, but first of all, some housekeeping. We'll talk for about 25 minutes, then open up for questions. Please put your questions in the chat, and I'll try to work our way through them. We will also try to talk slow for the captioning. But I can, fair warning, I can get a bit excited. But I have written this next bit down to keep myself focused. So a bit of context for this session. I recently recorded our December podcast with my colleagues Tara Judah and Thea Berry, and realised that Watershed, along with many other cinemas, will have been closed for 7 months of 2020. In those 7 months, audiences have not stopped watching films, but we have definitely stopped screening films. I've always been aware of cinema-going history, reaching a peak attendance in the late 1940s, then declining ever since in the face of competition from television, VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, and online. It's had a renaissance in the past few years. Indeed, last financial year, ironically, was our best ever at Watershed, with record admissions, thanks to the likes of Bait and Parasite. We even had plans for a fourth screen. COVID, I think we can agree, is a different order of existential threat. We have pivoted. We are currently doing virtual releases of films such as Possessor and Patrick. We've also presented films in a hybrid way. For example, with Akomfrah's Reel, we organised a free online preview, followed by Q&A with Aki, followed by an in-venue run of the film, followed by a virtual run. But something just doesn't feel right to me. In a very real way, this crisis has reinforced my commitment to the venue experience and the intrinsic value of the theatrical cinematic moment. I read John's piece in Sight and Sound about his relationship with the Rio and Dalston, and that sparked me to want a wider conversation about the value and the role of cinema. And here we are. As I say, I'm delighted to welcome John Akomfrah, whose body of work ranges across the groundbreaking Handsworth songs, 7 songs for Malcolm X, the Stewart Hall Project, Vertigo C, who, and I quote, has secured a reputation as one of the UK's most pioneering filmmakers, whose poetic works have grappled with race, identity, and post-colonial attitudes for over 3 decades. And Heather Stewart, who is BFI's creative director, has oversight of the BFI South Bank, festivals such as London Film Festival and Flare, publishing, including Sight and Sound magazine, and also, this is just a small one, the National Film and Television Archive, one of the largest and most important archives of its kind in the world. So, welcome both. I thought before we got into the meat of the discussion, I'm always interested in people's sort of personal cinematic journeys, and just wondered what yours are. What was the first memory of cinema, and also what was the first time when you thought to yourself that there's more to this than, in quotes, simply a good night out. Maybe Heather, do you want to go first on that?
Okay. My experience, I think, throws up the whole question, the difference between the words cinema and film and screen, and the way that people use those words interchangeably, and I really think they're not interchangeable. Content as well, which, by the way, I never, ever say. I was discussing what a film's about, but I'm never going to say something's a bit of content. Anyway, I grew up in a village of 300 people in rural Scotland. It was 2.5 hours to Glasgow. It was an hour on the bus to get to the nearest cinema. So I didn't grow up with cinema. The first cinema film I saw was when I was 5. My granny took me to see Barabbas, which is an insane choice, by the way. If any of you know the picture, it's Anthony Quinn is the criminal who Pontius Pilate frees in a big religious epic. I now know it's Technicolor, it's a Columbia Studio picture in very, very wide ratio, 2:20. And the crucifixion is filmed with a real eclipse of the sun happening. So the film is kind of amazing. For me, it did all the things, actually, even though it's a big studio film, that cinema can do, because the scale of it, because it is an epic, and the proximity to other humans who are enjoying it together. So there's an intimacy as well as epic. But that kind of heart-stopping identification that you get when you watch. I mean, I was identifying with Jesus, by the way, not Anthony Quinn, because I had to get my kilt on on a Sunday and go to Bible school whilst my parents lay around in bed. So I didn't know the stories that was on offer in this film. Anyway, what I'm saying is that the saturation, the luminosity, the magical aspect of being in the cinema was, I can't say that I could think through all of these things then, but what I've come to know, and as a teenager, when we got our hands on a 16mm projector in my village and started booking films from Harris Films, idiotically, cluelessly. And then I saw Pierre Le Fou when I was 16, and I suddenly thought, there is another world. There is a world that I don't know anything about. I've got to get the hell out of Dodge and go somewhere else to see this amazing world that God gave us there. So I think that thing about you saying at the beginning, that film, of course, can entertain, which Barabbas definitely does, but it can disturb you. And I think very importantly for me, it can give you solace and other things that are happening to you when you're in the cinema. You know, Almodovar talks about loneliness and going to the cinema as a place where things happen to you. And so for me, that's really important. And that happened even when I was 5 at Barabbas.
John, what about you?
I mean, I like Heather, and I think this is probably a generational thing, you know.
Well, I'm older than you, mate.
I'm not sure about that, Stewart.
You're both older than me, okay.
But there's a sense in which one encountered something which you knew later on to be, you know, posthumously as the cinema.
Yeah.
But when you first encounter it, it was really an event. It was a psychic event, you know. And in that respect, I have several firsts rather than just the singular. The first of the firsts, which is the idea of encountering the cinema as a kind of primal scene, was watching Dr. Zhivago at the Hammersmith ABC with my brothers and mum. I mean, I think that's the first time I realized, epic for sure, as Heather said, you know, I realized that this was a phantasmatic scene, you know, where you just can't imagine why anything so magnificent would be, you know, just in the dark, you know. I remember the first time I saw Julie Christie's face in close-up in Zhivago. I mean, it was just extraordinary, you know, and I've never got over that. I've never got over the umpteenth complex, complicated ways in which, you know, a camera found meanings, emotions in such a small space. It was just extraordinary. So that was one first, I suppose. The second, here I'm more a younger teenager. I used to go, you know, I lived very close to one of the famous rep cinemas in London in the 70s called the Paris Pullman. And the Paris Pullman was off the Fulham Road, very close to South Kensington, but really technically Chelsea. And I lived at the bottom of Chelsea, between Chelsea and Parsons Green. Anyone who knows West London will know what I'm talking about. So I would walk down the Fulham Road, which was a walk of contrasts, really, because you left, you know, the sort of lower middle class Parsons Green and went into Aristo Chelsea to get to the cinema. Nevertheless, when you got there, it was one of those places where I found courage, I found comfort. I don't want to use the word identity because it's too defining, but all sorts of affective states watching a range of stuff. And out of those, I think the first thing that I saw, which made me think, oh, hang on, I might be able to do this, was Tarkovsky's Mirror. I was 16. I didn't understand a fucking thing, I have to say. But I loved the moves. You know, it had these awkward gestures that I came to know as independent cinema later, or art cinema, if you will. I didn't then, you know. And I watched it almost in the state of a kind of fanzine rush. You know, when you suddenly realize that you have a kindred spirit, so someone you could walk into town with and show off, brag about what musics you knew and clothes you'd worn and so on. So it's a film that I class as my first, and I always return to it because of that recognition.
Yeah.
You know, there was a sort of itinerant spirit in my various quests and forays into the Paris Pullman. The Paris Pullman was not that far from the Tate. You could go to the Tate. But as a young person of color, every time I went to the Tate, which I did religiously every month, you got stared at quite a bit. You know? And there was a sort of solitude. The cinema was a space of solitude. You could find privacy, quite literally, as a young person. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't. I hadn't made a choice to watch Mirror. You know, the day before it was Monty Hellman's 5-lane blacktop. You know?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm interested in. Is that what, in a way, was it simply that the cinema was there showing a range of films, and it just so happened that one of those films was Tarkovsky?
Indeed.
It was like that. It wasn't like you thought, no, I must go and see a Tarkovsky. It was that the cinema was there offering a range of different kinds of films.
I mean, retrospectively, what I've now become aware of is that there are cinemas across London and the South Coast, to be honest, where the experience of a film and the location, they're fused for me, you know. So I can't think of Goodfellas, for instance, and The Age of Innocence, my God, without the Camden Plaza, because those were the geophysical spaces in which the experience of that. Those.
But can I just say something about that? I think that's a really important point, John, that when you see something in a cinema, you don't forget it. I find myself watching films on you know, I got a big telly at home, and halfway through realizing I've seen it before, but I saw it the first time also on a small screen. If I see it in the cinema, I can remember where I saw it and what was happening, and that's part of the meaning and pleasure that came to me. If I was in the Everyman in Hampstead versus if I was in the Scala when it was on Tottenham Street or whatever I was up to. So I think that thing of memory and connection to the big screen is really important.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, and just sort of moving on to your relationship with the Rio and Dalston, John. I mean, you talk about it obviously in that piece in Sight and Sound, but again, what was it that led you to the Rio? You know, what was why did you think, oh, I must drop in on the Rio, and how did it communicate itself to you, as it were?
This is a very long story, but I'll try and make it as short as possible. The Rio is important because taking film studies, one of the first experimental sort of O-levels of it in 76, I think, was close by. You know, it was in Whitechapel, and I'd come back from college. We'd set up a film collective. A group of us were on a road, and the road we were on, Ridley Market, was very, very close to the Rio. You know, so I dropped into the Rio for that reason. But I'd been running film societies since I was 16. You know, every further education college I went to, one of the things I tried to do was to either set up a Black Student Society or a film society, usually both. You know, and I remember screening Sebastiani, Jarman Sebastiani in 76 in Blackfriars College. And a fight erupted between people who hated the gay scenes in it and the people who wanted to defend it. So I always in my mind, there was always this connection between activism, I don't mean that necessarily in a political sense, and the act of commitment to cinema. There was always that. So I went to the Rio because I thought we might be able to begin other forms of activism there. And I was shocked to discover when I got there that there already were things in motion. They had a tape slide group in the basement, run by Hebron. You know, there was all sorts of stuff going on there. And I've always understood the importance of cinema as a sort of geophysical location, which manufactured affects, emotions, you know, proclivities, propensities. It wasn't just about watching films. I knew that from my experience of organizing film societies. I knew that much about the encounter with the cinematic, you know. So that was what I was hoping we would get. And what surprised me was, as I said, that it was already in the process of becoming precisely that by the time I arrived there.
And in retrospect, I mean, was the Rio management? Was there somebody that you spoke to, that you went to and said, you know, I want to do this, and they said, oh, great, you know, that's exactly what we want to do, or was it just a room? What was it there?
Okay, so at the time, two guys were curating it. Ramsey Cameron and Rob Ryder. Rob Ryder went on to then run the Barbican for years. Afterwards. And so we initially approached them to see whether we could do anything together. And of course, they agreed that we could program film screenings or have discussions about cinema in the basement, use the venue to hold political meetings, or cultural meetings. You know, they were really, really open to that. It's only really at that point that I realized there was something else, another edifice called a management committee that sat a bit like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain.
I know that one.
Of course, the curtain was prized open, and there they were. You know, I served then. So I mean, in a way, my ideas about management committees then weren't charitable ones at all, because I thought they were just impediments to what the curators and the programmers did. I became slightly more charitable because I sat in the Rio's management committee for a decade after that.
Yeah.
Trying to basically do what I still think has to be done, which is, you know, to protect the staff and license them to do what they want to do. You know, management committees are not and shouldn't be there to offer diktats about the way forward, because invariably most of us don't know anything about cinema.
And Heather, is that something that you recognise?
Not knowing anything.
A cinema's role could be or should be?
Well, central to what I'm up to is the thing you mentioned about running the National Archive. And the archive is governed by a royal charter. Most national collections either have a statute or a royal charter. We're royal charter. And the primary aim of which is our job is to promote the arts of film, television, moving image. And so the word art is very important in there in terms of deciding what we're up to. So, you know, for example, you're just mentioning Dr. Zhivago. I mean, Freddie Young also shot Ryan's Daughter and Lawrence of Arabia. And we hold those films in the collection. Spike Lee was on stage last year when we were showing Black Klansman, and he suddenly jumped up and asked for a phone from a member of the audience. And he held it up and he said, I just want to ask you all, do you want to see, I'm in the land of David Lean. Do you want to see Lawrence of Arabia on here? And he really started to praise our cinema. NFT1 is a great hall, as having wonderful sound and the place to see this film. So will we show the films in our collection digitally? Yeah, we've got our own VOD platform, of course, and DVD label and so on. And will we show Lawrence of Arabia digitally? Yeah, of course. But we will also show the 70mm film that David Lean made. This is the decisions that he and Freddie Young took around a very wide screen. It is 70mm. It's got, he uses Panavision for 7 minutes in that film when he shoots the Mirage scene. These things are really important. artistic innovations that he made that we preserve in the National Collection. And sometimes people talk to me as if I've just got some weirdo predilection that I want to be showing real films. And don't bother with that. Just so everyone gets it, 4K or even 8K that people love talking about in digital, a film like Lawrence of Arabia is like 45K. It doesn't, I mean, the amount of information held on that celluloid, on that negative, is amazing. And so the saturation and the feelings that you get when you sit in front of film, I think are quite, I need some neuroscientist to help me explain what's happening. But anyway, what I'm saying is we preserve those real things and we will show those real things. And I mean, I have to congratulate all the people who are here today in managing to keep going and having great cinema that they're coming back to with their audiences. But I would also like to hope for the future that we, the BFI, can support people also to show some real film and not only the digital version. But anyway, so that makes my driver a bit different from what we were just talking about a second ago, Mark, in terms of deciding what you do. There's a compulsion here to make sure that we're really showcasing the great films from our heritage.
Yeah, I think what I'm interested in is that it's that, as John's talked about with the Rio, is that, you know, you've got those communities around the venue. You've got people exploring different ideas. I mean, you said that the Rio was the home. I mean, Bernardine Evaristo was there working on women's theatre group. But what was the driver of the Rio is the cinema. At the heart of this is film, and the watching of films connects a lot. You know, it connects with that wider communities and society. So I sort of wonder, John, what were the films that were being watched, and did the films and the watching of the films connect with that activism, and also with the aesthetic of the developing aesthetic of your own work?
I mean, just to name check a couple of people, because I think that will give you an indication of the diversity in question. I mean, I remember standing on top of the roof of the Rio with Isaac Julian trying to film scenes that went into his first film, Who Killed Colin Roach. The first time I dabbled in tape slide was to do a project with Bernardine Evaristo and Patricia Hilaire, who were the Theatre of Black Women, during their rehearsals at the Rio, both downstairs and upstairs. There were 3 post-production houses around the corner from the Rio. The main one was a group called Anaris, who did umpteenth music videos, a lot of which were either then played, just to check cuts and so on inside, or sometimes as part of screenings in the basement. The Rio was very much a sort of pillar of that Dalston community. It felt part of that community. And I don't mean that in any kind of retro, pseudo-organicist bullshit way. Most of us that I remember from Dalston at that period were not from the area. Okay? None, apart from maybe Lena Gopal and Black Audio, none of us were even from Hackney. Most of the people who worked at the Rio were not from the area. So the Rio was part of one of those institutions that helped make that community, helped to construct that Dalston community and the wider East London arts community in general, and oftentimes that gets forgotten, because if you go too specifically for the experience of a film, you forget that the institutions like that are involved in generating all sorts of other things. I mean, what's his name? Julian Temple's Absolute Beginner had its premiere, I think, at the Rio. And there you could feel the power, the effective possibilities that films had for both creating communities and unmaking them at the same time.
I know what you mean with absolute beginners.
I think people assumed that it was going to kickstart all sorts of stuff. So it's one of the most depressing experiences I've ever had in the cinema, to see so many people who had been brought together by that film, by news of that film, who were hoping they would become a permanent community. It was a sad thing to see it then fracture and break up in the process of watching the film, actually, weirdly.
I mean, it's an amazing, it's a great illustration of the power of the relationship and connection between the audience and the artwork, you know, and that immediacy that you get with community and audience in relationship to a screening. And I've been in a few myself where especially when you have the privilege of seeing a film premiered in that 2,500 seat auditorium in Cannes, and you hear boos and you hear whoops of joy and you hear this and all happening at the same time, and it becomes so alive. But a slight curveball to Heather on Absolute Beginners, and I say this because I've always thought that Absolute Beginners is a great British film. It may well be a film maudit, as they say in fact, but it feels to me that it could be represented, and in a way, that's the never-ending job, isn't it? Of the BFI, of engaging with film culture, is that it's not fixed in any one time, and that there could be a moment when Absolute Beginners deserves to be seen again in the cinema in a new print and presented and appreciated and talked about, and it may well have something interesting to say about now, as I would argue it did then. I don't know if you want to respond to that lobbying, Heather.
There are many, look, whose voices are heard and what are the communities who are able to engage with those voices? So, of course, it might be Absolute Beginners, but there's loads of stories that you want to tell, especially at a national institution like us, where you're reappraising all the time what's considered to be the canon. I mean, just at the minute, for example, we're making new materials. I mean, you're mentioning Isaac there. We're just doing new materials on Young Soul Rebels, but also Passionate Remembrance. And so there's a case in point. I mean, that was co-directed with Maureen Blackwood, and it's never really referred to as the first British film where there was a woman director. In Gozzi's film, Welcome to the Terror Dome, which is nearly 10 years later, it's usually referred to. So you're also wanting to bring stuff back into circulation so people can really rethink what they've assumed to be was the case. And actually it wasn't. I mean, at the minute, we've got, I think, 188 films on BFI Player. If you could find them, our navigation needs fixing. If you type in black film, you can get Creature from the Black Lagoon, by the way. There's a few things we need to sort out there. Yeah. But actually, you can tell that whole history and really, let it speak to its audience. So, yeah, sure, Absolute Beginners. Why not?
But it's that point as well whereby, the history of film is now it's now substantial. It's constantly increasing, and how it gets repositioned and represented when it's in the cinema. And I'll tell an illustration from me, and apologies to some people that I'm sure have heard this before, but when I went to Il Cinema Ritrovato Festival in Bologna, which is one of the sort of great archive film festivals and representing restorations, there was a screening of John Ford's My Darling Clementine, and it was in a kind of 500-seat auditorium, which was packed. And Peter von Bach, the late Peter von Bach, introduced it, the festival director introduced it, and he simply came, it was a restoration, and he came on and he simply said, "This is the greatest American film ever made," and he walked off. And I thought to myself, hang on a minute, it's not even John Ford's greatest film, what's he talking about? By the end of the film, I actually thought, he's right, that is the greatest American film ever made. And it was the ability of that performance at that moment in time, but the opportunity to see that film back on the cinema screen with an audience, which made you rethink the canon. It made you rethink the relationship between that historical object and its relationship to now. And I just it felt to me that there was a power there that cinema had. And I just...
So you're a word community, Mark. I mean, John talking about community in relation to the Rio, but there's also communities of interest. So when I spent a lot of time in my life going to the London Filmmakers Co-op, or when I was a student in America, I went to the Anthology Film Archives. There was a community of interest around a particular kind of filmmaking. And you're a community of interest in Bologna of serious people who love film. But a 1946 black and white Western, let's just talk about getting an audience for that. However much I loved and I love going forward. How do I engage Gen Z? We're watching 68 videos a day on TikTok to think they would sit down and watch 90-minute 1946 black and white picture. I mean, I want to. I'm just.
No, I completely agree. And I see it as being the role of the cinema to engage the why you should come and see it part of it. So it is about connecting, and in a way, it relates to another point I was going to say. In an interview, I watched an interview with Jeremy Thomas, the great British producer Jeremy Thomas. He was in conversation with Mark Cosgrove at the Belfast Film Festival recently. And he said, the problem with the UK is that we love movies, but we don't love the culture of cinema. And I thought that was a really interesting statement. And then I read a piece in The Observer at the weekend where it talked about culture post-COVID, and it talked about galleries, it talked about theatre, it didn't talk about cinema. And do we have a problem in the UK with taking cinema seriously? We do. I mean, from my point of view, for the BFI, we are, part funded through the public purse by the taxpayer and lottery ticket buyers. And the DCMS, we're in the creative industries side of the DCMS, we're not in the culture side. And it immediately creates difficulties in the conversation because they're driven by certain goals to do with growth and so on, which of course the BFI is also involved in. But if I'm looking at the archive, that's a very problematic conversation. And the other big, I don't know whining about this, but the other national collections, the V&A is design, the Imperial War Museum is conflict, they are in a different conversation with different kinds of civil servants who are thinking about culture in that way. And that has led to big investments in those areas, actually. I mean, the Mendoza Review in 2017 led to huge investments across the cultural sector, but we weren't part of the conversation. So you're right. We could say that in 87 years, the BFI hasn't made people think film is an art form in the way the others are. And John, you were nodding your head there.
Yes. Well, I mean, this is now a very complex proposal. I think for me there was a sort of optimism, utopian optimism, in the famous Bazin, formulation. What is cinema? Because the assumption was that there was a future to it, and it was. I mean, I think we now need to pose that question posthumously. What was cinema? Not because it's dead, I don't believe that, but because I think what's been generated in its becomings is so vast that we need some sort of account, what the economic ledger of all of it. And when you put that ledger together, one of the things you realized, that I realized anyway, was that apart from being a culture, the cinema was also and has been a set of philosophical propositions about the nature of time, light, space, the behavior of human beings, of things, of sentient and non-sentient things, and the problem now is that there is a vast field that one could call a cinematic culture for me, and not all of it resides solely or wholly in the cinema, right? So part of the conversation that we have to continue to have is about an expanded culture for the cinema, right? That includes the different neurodiverse ways in which people are engaging with the legacy of the cinema. And that's a complicated conversation because it does begin to sound sometimes, occasionally, as if one is bashing cinema for something else. Far from it. I mean, in a way, I'm trying to find a way now of recognizing the very rich heritage of the cinema, and the offshoots that it's created, which are not in principle hostile to it.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that somebody wants to watch something being streamed need not necessarily be a statement against going to the cinema. They're not mutually exclusive categories. They're diverse, neurodiverse, but they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So we have to begin to have a conversation which recognizes this variety. Does that mean we forget about the cinema? Absolutely fucking not. I mean, why would anyone want to do that? But I think it will be enhanced. The culture that Jeremy talks about will be enhanced if we recognize the complex ways in which this is happening.
I mean, they're thinking about when the BFI is sort of outside this. MoMA, for example, thinking about America, encompasses film, cinematic film, within the art collection that they hold as a major art museum. And that isn't true here. There's that split. So you're moving between the two. Your Four Nocturnes that was in the Ghana Pavilion in Venice last year is completely fantastic installation. Ditto Mimesis that was at the 1418 now. So you're moving between what's essentially is an institution, is within an art world context, and an institution that's called cinema. And then cinema is dominated, we know, not now with COVID, but normally 14 new films every week, too much staff, and dominated by the franchise and the formula film. So people here today, I don't know if I can't see you, but I'm assuming
we can.
Our specialist cinema world, and already there's a problem, isn't there, with the word specialist cinema or cultural cinema. Like it's not like art where you can say the word art and people roughly know what you're talking about. Once you start saying specialist cinema, what is that? Is it something, So anyway, as Mark said at the beginning, we've talked about these things before, but that thing hasn't gone away. And there's two different institutions that strikes me. One is an art world one, and quite apart from VOD platforms and how you see films, of course. Anyway, it may not matter. I'm just wondering if there's things that you demand to be seen in a space that's called cinema that you watch with a particular kind of community of people in an audience.
I just want to, at this moment, I just want to remind the audience out there, and there is an audience out there, and they're an engaged audience. A lot of people are running cinemas as well, and are certainly involved as well. And if they've got any questions, do put them in the chat button at the top, and it will come through on my WhatsApp message. But it is a key point, this dichotomy, the industry, because we talk about the film industry as well. We talk about specialized film, we talk about the film industry, and they often seem at tension with each other. And I think what's been interesting is, digital was definitely a disruptor in terms of delivery mechanisms and slowly changing the industrial model, particularly in the commercial mainstream. But what COVID has done is truly disrupted that model. And I think what's interesting is that you are seeing now cinemas going back to repertory. So, you have this, these multiplexes have got 14, 15 screens and the ones that have chosen to stay open are showing rep films, It's a narrow range of rep films. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing. It's Back to the Future. I'd quite like to go back to the past, but you can see. I wonder if that's a kind of it's a note of optimism in terms of re-engaging with that history of film.
Absolutely. I mean, look, as an 18-year-old. Running a film society in Blackfriars College, I knew all these companies, Contemporary Films, Harris Films, a whole bunch of them who you could hire 16mm prints from, right? And so you'd go, to Perivale or Surbiton, all these places on the outskirts of London, to pick up these prints to show. And each component of this experience was valuable. Each segment of it was valuable. I think the rep experience of cinema was one of the most incredible of the 70s. To go to the other cinema on a Saturday and see The Hour of the Furnaces, Saturday afternoon, and then turn up in the evening to watch, Effie Bricht or any of the Fassbinders, was a remarkable experience, because you were, all these incredible neural pathways being opened in very distinct ways by two very, very different experiences of the cinematic film essay in the morning, the reimagined costume drama in the evening, genres, experiences, possibilities offered to you. I don't have a problem with rep at all. And in a way, the reason I mentioned going to Harris was that when you got to Harris, you picked up your film and then went to Contemporary in Notting Hill to get your, art one. Each experience was valuable. Harris had a warehouse filled with hundreds. I remember them badgering them to see if we can get a copy of The Searchers on 16mm, because I thought it was a great film even then, and not having any joy because they said, oh, well, it's VistaVision and we can't, I thought, what are you talking about? All of these things that now make sense but didn't make sense then. Sorry, I'm rambling on a bit, but I mean, in a way, the ramble was it for me.
Yeah.
The derive, as they say in France, the wonder was the point,
I'm just getting questions through, and I'm trying to capture some of them, and I'll put them. I'll try and articulate them. Which is one is why it's this was to Heather, but I think it was actually to me. Why do we have to try and engage Gen Z with a black and white 1940s Ford film?
Well, I might not need to. I mean, does the question, we should only give the audience what the audience already thinks it knows and wants, which is the role of the algorithm, of course, and constantly giving you the same thing? Or do we hope, what John's describing for his generation and mine is the serendipity of coming on things that by constantly going to a place, in his case it was the Rio, or the cinema in Plymouth when you were a student, or whatever it is. And I'm just thinking aloud, but we need to engage young audiences with film. It's my job. We're thinking about the heritage of British film, and our other Royal Charter objective is world cinema. And as we're paid for by the taxpayer, I'm very keen on getting people to be able to see, the full range of work, not just the big famous stories. And anything that becomes older becomes problematic, is all I'm saying. So my darling Clementine, it's not my darling Clementine, it's will I be able to engage young audiences in anything other than what they already like and share and know now? And the nature of education, and we're also an educational charity, and I think any parent would hope and think this, is that you want to see something, even if just once, that surprises you. The thing that John was talking about a minute ago, that even if you didn't understand it and it was completely mystifying, that can be a great experience, actually, and make you think about it and actually make you want to come back to it. So it depends what kind of lives we want to lead and what we want to happen. But I think that's an educational thing about not always having the same.
I also think that there's something to be said for changing the ways in which we talk about cinema's histories, its multiple histories. My Darling Clementine is important because it's made by a figure who went through that transition that became important in our world. John Ford fought in the Second World War, albeit behind a camera. And he was part of that generation that will reimagine the real, what constitutes the real for us, right? which said we will be the custodians of this complicated thing called realism, the reality of things, which is now ending. Yeah, that's what's going. And is it important in the same way that it's important for people to know that there was something called a book called Crime and Punishment? Yes, absolutely. Because, there's encoded in My Darling Clementine isn't simply a story, right? It's an experience and a response to the world after the horrors of the Second World War. And people need to know that. Young people need to know that. Do you force them to then turn out and grab them by all? No, but it is our responsibility to keep insisting that there's a legitimacy to watching My Darling Clementine. It's by no.
I don't want to force anything on anybody, but I'm also aware, going back to the sort of no decision needed, when you get something in front of people and they don't expect it, it can be a truly inspiring experience. I was in Paris once and I saw a bunch of 10-year-olds and they were watching film by Samuel Beckett. It's got Buster Keaton in it. There's two versions. There's one with Maxwell, but it was this one. And it's a film about, if we want to get highfalutin, it's about scopophilia. It's about the pleasure in looking in the dark at something on the screen. So on one level, it's a highly intellectual film. These kids absolutely understood that film and were riveted. There was not, you could have heard a pin drop. They were complete. Now, would they choose to go and see that film if they were paying money and go to cinema? I mean, obviously not, but it was about what was happening in their education in relation to what was being presented to them. And all I'm saying is, you get Shakespeare shoved down your throat at school, but why not keep proselytizing for My Darling Clementine? I like the film.
I mean, in a way, in a way, I'm sorry I mentioned it because
awesome, My Darling Clementine.
I know exactly. I tell you what, I hope everybody's going out and watching it and programming it now.
Well, I've seen it for about 30 years.
We'll probably see her, but I think I misrepresented. I've been told I misrepresented the question from Susan, so apologies because I think Susan's sort of probably banging on the computer screen at the moment, but. I think this might be related to it, which is the lack of rep programming out with an established canon. So one of the arguments would be is that John Ford's the established canon, even though My Darling Clementine's not part of that canon. Anyway, John Ford's part of the established canon. What we simply do is replicate that. We need to go beyond the Hitchcock Godard retrospectives, which are limiting to the audience, like Generation Z audiences, in developing a deeper love of cinema.
Yeah, agree. You need the mix. I mean, it was Godard's 90th birthday yesterday, and I know why lots of young people can't stand how he goes on. Equally, loads adore him, of course. You want the mixture. If I think of Black audiences, I don't know anybody who doesn't want to see the films of Oscar Michaud. They're a complete mess and they're incomplete and you can't even restore them and so on and so forth. But the audience wants a chance to see them because they've heard about them but never seen them because they're difficult to see. Is that, how do you mix it up so that your audiences can find something that really speaks to them?
And I mean, a slightly... maybe relates to the culture definition, culture commercial definition in the way that cinema operates ultimately within a commercial model. And the management committees, John, that you referenced earlier on, but cinemas do have that commercial imperative and at this moment in time with COVID, to stay open. I mean, your focus is you have to stay open, and for a lot of people, showing the latest James Bond, which gets moved, throws your business model. And if you don't get those kinds of films in your program, you can't survive. So culture can go to hell, as it were. Is that broader discussion can go to hell, and maybe we need to think of how cinemas and an approach to cinema is remodeled.
Well, I mean, I walked past the Rio yesterday because I still live very close to it. And it's one of the saddest features is to see it still closed, But I thought when it was open, like many cinemas across the country, was trying desperately to come up with its own version of the sort of the PPI, where you're, getting Icon to give you via whoever distributes a bond, a 2-week window for it, and then an Almodovar next week, and that model is not dead in my view. I don't think that's dead at all. Now, whether it will get the chance to revitalize itself post-COVID, I don't know. But I wouldn't get rid of that. It seems to me the problem is when you're relying almost wholly and completely on a diet of Hollywood stuff, which is dried up.
Yeah, well, exactly. It has what it's shown. COVID has shown is what a cinema landscape is like if you take the tentpole releases out.
And either that, or if you marry that with the streaming giants telling you can't have. For some reason, they seem to be the only ones who've got films. They don't want to let go of them. Whether it's Netflix or Amazon, they've got quite a few and just don't seem to want to let go. So a perilous landscape to navigate would be my prognosis. But there's no reason why the model that we knew should not continue to work. I don't see anything that destroys that.
But Mark, can I ask you, even without James Bond, we're social animals. We've been talking here about community, and everyone's fed up sitting around in their kitchens on Zoom or whatever they're doing, or being unemployed or whatever it is. And so going somewhere that's relatively cheap as well is a really important point about cinema. Historically, this is a working class, another aspect of film culture that's important. But anyways, cheap to go to compared to loads of other places you might go, and you're actually able to go. So isn't this a moment when people are wanting to go out and will take chances to look at things? So you don't have to rely on James Bond because that's not what they know. That's not what they're going out for.
My own thought on this, and it's developed over the past 10 years since digital happened, is really that cinema now. It used to be the top of the pyramid, and everything flowed from the release of the film, the theatrical release of the film. But with day and date releases happening, certainly in the independent sector for a long time, it's more about where does the cinema sit in relationship to the rest of the possibilities of watching films, and that really what you have to do as a venue is to why should people come to your venue as a way of watching films? I've just been told that we've only got a few minutes left. And there's one really burning question for John, and it's when is he making his TikTok debut?
Forget it.
I don't know whether that was on screen or off screen, but I don't know whether that'll become part of your vocabulary, vocabulary going forward.
There's such skill required to make those talks. I'm not sure I've got those, to be honest.
Yeah, you make it. You make a TikTok if it was 3 hours long.
Yes, correct. Exactly.
So listen, I want to thank you both for a really stimulating conversation, and I certainly hope that we will be able to continue this in a venue after watching a film, over a drink, socially at some point in the future. But thank you, Heather and John. Thanks very much.
This is a pleasure of this. Absolute pleasure of this. Two old friends I haven't seen for years. And where do I meet you? Online. Fantastic. Lots of love to you both.
Brilliant.